Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film as we look at the issue of manning the massive armies of the Union and the Confederacy. Now, when the war began, both sides depended on volunteers. Here we see Gay Street in downtown Knoxville with men volunteering at one end of the street for the Union Army, at the other end of the street for the Confederate Army, East Tennessee being that way. But pretty soon both sides ran low on volunteers, and both sides passed conscription laws. The first were passed in 1862 in the South, in 1863 in the North, the first time there was a nationwide draft in the United States. Not only did this bring new men into service, but in some cases, particularly in the South, it also kept volunteers from leaving the Army when their term of enlistment was up, as men typically volunteered for a number of months or years, but now perhaps more years than they had originally intended. Furthermore, in both the North and the South, there were ways around the conscription laws. In both countries, anyone who could afford to could hire a substitute to take his place in the Army. In the North, it was also possible to pay a $300 commutation fee in order to avoid service, which may not sound like a whole lot of money today, but that was probably about $30,000 in 1863. And in the South, a fear of slave insurrection was so great that anyone who owned or served as an overseer of 20 slaves or more was allowed to stay home and make sure the slaves stayed down on the farm. So on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, these methods of avoiding the draft created deep resentment. Private Sam Watkins from Company H in the 1st Tennessee Regiment of the Confederate States Army explained a law was made by the Confederate States Congress at this time allowing every person who owned 20 Negroes to go home. It gave us the blues. We wanted 20 Negroes. Negro property suddenly became very valuable, and there was raised the howl of rich man's war, poor man's fight. An accusation of a rich man's war and a poor man's fight was not unique to the South, particularly in New York City, which in those days was simply Manhattan Island and a very heavily Democratic area, one that indeed considered seceding from the Union when the war began. Many of them, especially Irish immigrants, said it was not their fight. And when the first names were drawn for the draft in July 11th, 1863, riots broke out. As New Yorkers, primarily Irish immigrants, rioted, doing $1.5 to $2 million worth of damage, killing at least 50 people, many of them African Americans whom the rioters blamed for the war. Eventually, the U.S. Army was sent in to crush the riots, even bringing in some soldiers straight off the battlefield at Gettysburg.